This is Pet Life Radio. Let's talk pets.
Welcome to Aquariumania. I'm your host, Dr. Roy Anong, speaking to you from the University of Florida's Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory. Thanks for joining us. How does a Swiss aquarium fish enthusiast go from molecular cancer research to leadership roles for both Amazonas Magazine, a must-read resource for aquarium hobbyists, and Swiss Tropicals, a company specializing in aquarium filtration systems? Join us as my guest, Dr. Stefan Tanner, senior co-editor and co-publisher of Amazonas Magazines and head of Swiss Tropicals, describes his aquarium fish journey from Switzerland to Minnesota. We'll be right back after these messages.
Does your dog itch, scratch, stink, or shed like crazy? Come to Dynovite for help.
Order a 90-day supply of Dynovite.
Dynovite for life.
Pick up 2 tubes of Doggo Suds.
Get the 3rd tube free.
Peppermint, tea tree, lavender, Doggo Sud shampoo.
Made with all-natural coconut, jojoba, aloe. Great for healthy skin and soft, shiny coats.
But no itchy, harsh chemicals.
Lather up, rinse away.
Try Doggo Suds. Buy 2, get 1 free.
At Dynovite.com.
DINOVITE.com.
Let's Talk Pets on PetLifeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Aquariumania on Pet Life Radio. My guest today is Dr. Stefan Tanner, senior co-editor and co-publisher of Amazonas Magazine and head of Swiss Tropicals. Thanks for joining us, Stefan.
Well, thank you for having me on today. Thanks.
Well, I appreciate your obviously your time, but also you're getting all your kind of background information. I did a little reading of your website as well for Swiss Tropicals, and yeah, quite very fascinating. I didn't obviously know a lot of the your background before, so it'll be interesting to kind of delve into that a little bit. I usually start with some kind of personal questions, nothing too personal. So, how did you first become interested in fish? How old were you, and kind of what sort of aquarium setups and species did you keep?
Well, I guess I was sort of the prototypical geeky guy, not too popular in school, kind of, hanging out with myself and interested simply in everything that sort of crawls and flies and swims. And as a kid, we dug ponds. That was very popular in the early 80s in Switzerland. So rich people wanted a nice garden pond, so we dug ponds. And then we sold them frogs, which hopped right back to our ponds, so we can sell them a bunch of times over. But the sort of thing eventually came to, other than nature outside, it was like keeping fish inside. And after a bunch of discussions with my parents, they allowed me to buy a tank, and they insisted it has to be a new one because they were kind of afraid that the old ones I was looking at were gonna leak. So I got a brand new 75-gallon tank, which of course at that time, age 14, was quite an endeavor. And so I started keeping fish like almost everybody. You just buy different things, put it together, and figure out later it doesn't work when you put a walking catfish with a bunch of tetras, because you're only going to have a walking catfish after a while. And over time, I learned that, I want to do this right, and started to buy aquatic literature. That's really sort of in 84. That's where everything got started, and kind of the circle closed again when I bought Amazonas Magazine last year.
Okay, well, that's very, again, like you said, kind of typical, but also atypical in a sense. How would you say the hobby was in Switzerland compared to, obviously you don't know the same time frame, but maybe compared to the U.S. as far as you were aware?
Well, I would say most of the market at that time, sort of in the pet trade, was ruled by small independent stores. I mean, big chain stores did not exist at that point, and that was, 82, sort of in that time frame, 82, 85. And some of them were better, some of them were a little not so sophisticated.
Right. Sure.
But overall, that, I was lucky that I met an elderly store owner who kind of didn't get totally upset with me asking a million questions and hanging out in the store for like 3 hours straight after school. So that eventually, got me, more knowledge, more experience, connected me to people that also like fish. And for the longest time, there were 3 of us, 2 gentlemen who were actually about 10 years older than I was at that time. And so rather than hanging out with people that are about my age, I was usually hanging out with people that were significantly older.
That's why you're so mature.
Well, I age every day is not necessarily getting better. I love wine and cheese. They both get better with age. I'm not sure that applies to me.
Let's talk a little bit about, you've obviously done a lot of education from, my reading and seeing your background. You attended the University of Bern and studied ecology and molecular biology. What kind of made you interested in that?
Well, I was always fascinated with zoology. So that's the sort of track that I took. And I was kind of a little bit under pressure. My parents weren't exactly rich, meaning that while school overall is free in Switzerland, meaning you don't really pay anything but $500 or so for a semester for, basic insurance and library access and stuff, you still have costs to live. And in Switzerland, life costs are not exactly cheap. So my dad said, we give you one chance, so take it. And I did. So I put all kinds of things together, like geography parts with hydrology and agricultural pedology, meaning soil sciences, and botany and zoology, just so I could cram everything together in the shortest time frame, because he needed to fulfill a certain number of so-called blocks. And so I had all kinds of weird things together. But I think it allowed me to kind of understand certain things. So if somebody later on talked about ecology, when plants and insects play a role, then I kind of understood that, the hydrology and pedology part, meaning the soil and precipitation, also matter because that dictates what grows, etc. So these kind of having a holistic view, understanding how things interact, was a major part of my interest. It always fascinated me trying to figure out how can you keep something in captivity so that it essentially lives a normal life.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So while you were in going through, I guess, your undergraduate, kind of college years, you also worked at a local fish and pet shop. Can you tell us a little bit about what you learned during that period of time?
Yeah, that started, like anybody going through school and college, at least at that time, you had to have a job because otherwise you didn't have any money to spend. And I, blew away almost all my money on fish and equipment. And so in that regard, I worked at various different factories, metal factories and other things. And eventually, by happenstance, through a friend, they said, well, that store further up in the mountains is looking for somebody. And I've visited that store occasionally. And so I went there and asked, and the next Saturday I was working there. And this became one of my best sort of jobs and friendship at the same time, because the couple who owned the store and I became very close in terms of doing things beyond just working there. And for the longest time while I was during undergrad years, he was hoping that I would eventually take over the store down the line. And at one point, once I started my PhD work, it became sort of, time-wise a little bit more difficult to do, and eventually stopped working there. But I learned a lot about basic things in terms of marketing, buying stuff. Today, say a lot, Swiss Tropical's whole philosophy of sell stuff at a decent price, not overpriced, but also don't try to cheap it out for no reason. Don't play the Walmart game, because the race to the bottom has literally no winners. And he was always like, buy the best fish or the best supplies money can buy, because if you buy the best stuff, then you can offer the best service with those products. And that was kind of something I learned from Peter, the owner, who was always very adamant that, especially when it comes to livestock, there is no second best. There is just the best fish that is good and lives, is going to make you money as a business person, but is also going to be making the customer happy, because obviously he will hopefully make him a happy fish keeper.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned your PhD. You ended up going into human molecular genetics, and then I guess you moved to the U.S. and started more research at Ohio State. Can you, I guess, maybe give us a real quick brief on that?
Yeah, this was one of those things where parsimony or happenstance comes together in terms of when I finished my master's, and I was working with great tits, figuring out if females that have a high parasite load look for other males to mate with. And yeah, there's a correlation that if they have more parasites, they're more likely to have offspring in the nest that are not of the male that is feeding the babies. So, but once that was over, the professor who at that time was offering me a PhD position simply said, well, you can start working, but I don't have any money to pay you. And yeah, that was not sort of a good option for me. And then at the same time, a friend of mine finished her thesis at the University Children's Hospital in Bern, and she was working on X-linked myotubular myopathy, which is a rare inherited disorder that is lethal in males. And yeah, I interviewed, got that position, and I was literally super lucky. I was at the right time in the right place. And 2.5 years later and 6 papers later, I had my PhD, which was very fast and very, I was literally very lucky. I mean, most people take longer, but very often it has more to do with what your project is, how long it takes, not necessarily with how much effort you put into it. Obviously, that plays a role too, but sometimes the topic can be a problem. And then once I was finished with that, or close to finishing it, we had a regular meeting in Holland where sort of a European Council of Rare Disease Specialists comes together. And that's, simply because individual rare cases do not occur so often. So in order to figure out ways of scientifically exploring them and treating them, you have to compile resources. And this neuromuscular center effort, it was really great because you got to know literally everybody in the field at those meetings. And I asked, is there any postdoctoral options anywhere? And one of my Finnish friends suggested to contact a person in Ohio who just moved there. And short story was I moved to Ohio in 98, then met my wife in the first year, or future wife at that time. And then kind of stranded in Ohio. And then in 2012, we moved up here to Rochester, Minnesota, when she got a great job offer from Mayo Clinic. And I said at that time, fabulous. You got a good job. You're an MD. I'm a PhD. So I'm just going to retire now.
I want to hit one more topic before we take a break.
Sure.
I noticed you early on were pretty active with, and I always definitely advocate folks joining aquarium fish organizations, but you were really active with the International Society for Barbs, Tetras, Loaches, and Catfishes, which I guess in German or Swiss is the IGBSSW. So how did they group those together, and how did you get involved and enjoy your membership and leadership roles in that group?
Well, it came about, I guess there's two stories to it. One is it was formed because there were, lots of life bearer, Kili associations, cichlid associations, all that kind. But there was literally nobody doing the fish species that have that Weberschen apparatus, which is kind of a morphological modification. And that some of the founders in, it was 89, decided that why not put those together. You have to keep in mind when it came to catfish, other than maybe a dozen different Corridora species, some bristlenose and some hypostomus and sailfin plecos, there was nothing in the trade. I mean, a few whiptails, nobody knew what they were. They were all formerly called Rhineloricaria parva. And nothing was known. But I'm a typical cave dweller, meaning I like stuff that hides and is not necessarily very colorful. And so when I heard about that organization, and that actually was, I think it happened through the editor of the DATS magazine in Germany, the very famous DATS magazine, Rainer Stabikowski, and I met at a meeting in Switzerland. And he said, I know a German guy who is very much in catfish, and that is Hans-Georg Gevers in Hamburg. So a few months later, I took the train to Hamburg. We met, and Ingo Seidel, another catfish enthusiast, came as well. And 3 of us went to East Germany at that time, shortly after the reunification, and met with East German breeders there. And this was a seminal meeting in my life in terms of, I met people that are just absolutely fantastic in terms of what they breed. I mean, they have bred stuff 30 years ago we have troubles with today. And they simply had to, because they had no access to new fish all the time like we are used to. So everything that ever made it into East Germany, they put every effort to breed it. And that was really fantastic. And they were also very modest, very humble people that were just, getting together, talking about fish. And they didn't care that I was young and didn't know much. They were like welcoming and shared knowledge very freely. So it was a really, really intriguing thing. And eventually they joined BSSW, the West German organization. And I think it was in 93 or so. The previous editor resigned. And I was, bold enough to hold up my hand in the back, not knowing what I'm going to get into. And so I did the editing and layouting and everything of the BSSW report, which is produced quarterly for 93 to 2006. So once I moved to the US, we had to do everything, via computer. Before, there was still the time when you actually send printing materials by mail from point to point. I mean, today you could not imagine doing that, but that was the rule then. Obviously, the distances were shorter than here in the US, but still, that's how I ended up doing that.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, let's take a short break, and then we'll continue our discussion with Dr. Stefan Tanner of Amazonas Magazine and Swiss Tropicals after these messages from our sponsors.
Hey there, pet parents. Michelle Fern here. As busy pet parents, we often forget about our own needs, and we need to take care of ourselves so we can reach our goals and make our lives that much more fulfilling. Well, there's something that is there to make it better for you, and that's called BetterHelp Online Counseling. You can connect with a professional counselor in a safe and private online environment, and it's super convenient. You can use a desktop, you can use mobile device, and it's iPhone and Android friendly. You can also use a video session. You can use chat or text, whatever you choose. They hook you up with one of their many counselors. They have over 3,000 licensed therapists across the United States. These licensed professionals specialize in depression, anger, family conflict, anxiety, insomnia, trauma, grief. They cover everything. Now, Pet Life Radio has a special discount for you. You'll save 10% off your first month with the discount code PETLIFE. Go ahead and connect with BetterHelp.com and start making your life even that much better.
Let's talk pets.
Let's talk pets
On Pet Life Radio.
Pet Life Radio.
PetLifeRadio.com.
We're back and continuing our conversation with my guest, Dr. Stefan Tanner of Amazonas Magazine and Swiss Tropicals. So we kind of got a little bit of insight into sort of your background and education. I kind of wanted to hit on Swiss Tropicals first, and then we'll move on to Amazonas. But so I learned from your website that you had a fish room in Ohio when you, I guess, sometime after you moved to the States with 63 tanks. What did you end up keeping in all those tanks, and what kind of was piquing your interest at that time?
Well, always catfish. Catfish were sort of the first thing that always came about. I actually started off in a small apartment with my wife. I think it was in 2002 or something. I said, I've always kept fish. And she was kind of like, okay. So after a while, we had a bunch of tanks all over the apartment, in the bedroom, in the living room, in the office. And eventually we decided, we're going to hang out longer in Columbus than was originally planned. And so we looked for a house. And the most important thing at the house was finding a house that has a basement where you could stick a bunch of fish tanks. And then I ordered, 70 some tanks from a manufacturer. and set them up. And that was the first time when I kind of realized that gets a little out of hand because suddenly I have all these shelving parts in the basement and piles of tanks in the garage and all kinds of supplies piled up, and that it actually takes quite a lot of time to put everything together. But then once that was set up, I started, barbs, tetras, loaches, and catfish. It was really the BSSW again, except in life form, that became the sort of the center. That was also, of course, about a good 10 years after the so-called L number catfish boom, the pleco boom started, with all those fish mostly from the central Amazon basin. And that totally changed the hobby because suddenly we were used to getting some fancy Malawi and Tanganyikan cichlids that were expensive, but usually they were expensive for a very brief period of time because most of them are rather easy to breed. Well, a few Tanganyikans excluded, but most of the larger Malawis are not that difficult. So they came in, were super expensive, and within a short time period, the price dropped. Well, it was different with the catfish. They came in and we killed literally thousands of them because we didn't know how they lived. We didn't understand that they were living in very warm water that is very clear, very highly oxygenated, and has absolutely no organic traces whatsoever. It's not an Amazon river like you think. It's more like a clear water creek up in the mountains, except it's very warm. And we didn't know all that. We also didn't know that these fish, for the most part, don't eat algae or plant matter, that they are actually mostly carnivores. And so we killed bazillions of fish in the initial years until we started to understand how these species actually live.
So let's segue over to Swiss Tropicals. And when I was kind of going through your website, you mentioned a lot of it was actually founded on your need for materials for your HMF, which I had to look up and learned it's the Hamburger Motten filter. Is that correct?
That is right, yeah.
Yeah, because I think you mentioned on your site as well, it's really not, I hadn't heard of it before. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that and I guess how that became sort of the basis for a lot of your, the business end of Swiss Tropicals?
Yeah, reticulation of filter foam kind of developed in the 60s and 70s. And I think that was at some time, people say sometime in the 1970s, somewhere in Hamburg, somebody came up with the idea of sticking a piece of foam at the end of a tank and then pumping the water from one side to the other using an airlifter tube. And nobody really truly knows where it originated, but it's entirely possible that it was that region because that was sort of the center of innovation in the aquatics hobby in Europe at that time. And I knew the foam, the so-called famous blue foam, for years working in the store. We used it for all kinds of things. And when I came to the US, I was kind of looking around, trying to set up my tanks, and not to very much avail. Multiple companies I contacted couldn't even tell me what the foam exactly is that they sell. And some were just laughing at me in terms of like, yeah, you're not, important enough. I was like, okay. Went back to Europe, got into contact with EMW, is the manufacturer of one of the various types of foams, and eventually became their US distributor. And we go back 12 some years, or more than 12 years of working together. And it was literally just trying to build my own fish room. And then people saw it and said, hey, can I get that? And eventually it was actually Discus Hans in Baltimore who encouraged me to do it commercially because he obviously wanted a bunch of foam too. And that got it all started. And with the first few pallets in the garage, I told my wife, well, either I'm going to have foam for the rest of my life or this is a good idea. So I guess the latter applied in the long run. But yeah, a lot of people didn't know what it's all about. And it's still fairly unknown, but I'm not spending a huge amount of time on advertisement. And unfortunately, I'm not a good videographer or anything. So I, no
YouTube videos yet.
Yeah, I literally need to have somebody do that for me, simply because I don't have the patience for doing stuff like that.
Well, you had some nice pictures on I think it was on your website, because I was trying to figure out how that worked. I think it was on your website. I was trying to remember. But yeah, so I guess you just feel they're very efficient and real good filters, I guess. Is that kind of
Well, the principle is actually, and that comes back to ecology, studying how these things interact. The idea of the filter foam is essentially that it's just a huge biotope, a huge habitat for filter organisms. The foam itself is really not doing that much. It's literally just trapping particles, but it's a microorganism which digests all the organic material that comes into it. And, to give you an idea, a block in a 10-gallon tank in terms of filter surface is as big as a medium-sized canister filter at a fraction of its cost.
Okay.
Plus, you don't have any hoses that hang over the side, so there's no risk of leaking or power problems. An air-driven filter, if you have a power outage, which in Columbus was quite common, then if you have tons of little pumps running and hang-on backs or little internal filters, they have the nasty habit that when the power comes back on, when they're a little full of sludge, they just don't come back on. And then you come back in the evening and you have a bunch of, filters that didn't turn back on, and you have to go around the fish room and restart them.
Right.
With an air-driven filter, that problem never exists. The pump comes back on and comes back on, and with one single air pump, you can do the whole room. And if you have a longer power outage, a small battery setup or a generator can run the whole fish room, which makes, emergency maintenance a lot easier.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, let's talk a little bit about Amazonas now. So definitely one of my favorite aquarium hobby magazines. Beautiful pictures, great articles, really good detail, and very well researched. So how did you first become involved with Amazonas?
Well, we touched on Hans-Georg Evers before, early in my career, and Hans-Georg is actually the founding editor of Amazonas magazine in Germany, and that started up in the early 2000s. And by 2012, an English edition was published by Reef to Rainforest in Vermont. And shortly thereafter, I became involved as the translator for both Amazonas and Coral magazine, because Hans suggested me to James Lawrence, the owner of Reef to Rainforest, to do the translations, simply because I guess on top of speaking both languages, I also know a few things about fish. And that is, of course, quite helpful in terms of, making sure that the context actually is correct after the translation. And so for years I did the translations, and a little bit over a year ago, James decided that he would like to step back a little. And so I talked to my colleagues, Matt Peterson and Mike Tuccinardi, about, if we could handle that. And so we jumped into it, set up a new company, Aquatic Media Press, that is now essentially owning Amazonas magazine. So we still license the German content. We, of course, add our own, because there's certain articles that are not good for the U.S. market. Say, for example, snakeheads. While certainly interesting, snakeheads are totally illegal in the U.S. And henceforth, it's not, you don't really do people a favor if you talk big about something they can't keep.
That's right.
That's, on one hand, not, you could argue the knowledge or the interest might still be there, but you might also encourage people to do stupid things like smuggling them into the country, which is, and I always emphasize that, is actually bad. I mean, you can argue if the rule is justified, you can debate that. If you don't like the rule, there is ways of addressing that and trying to change those rules. But just ignoring them is actually counterproductive for the whole hobby, because if we have a bunch of black sheep that do stupid things, then the result is usually the regulations get tougher, and then the 99% who do fish keeping legally with the best intentions have to pay the price for that 1% who is too dumb who follow the rules.
So I wanted to touch base a little bit on the current issue, July, August, and the theme of natives. And I guess, it's since Amazonas is in out of Europe as well as the U.S. It's really focusing on North American natives. Can you explain the interest? I mean, my understanding is that Europe has a real keen interest in North American native fishes. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I guess there's always the thing for what's new. I mean, a lot of the hobby is driven at the forefront by the enthusiasts, by those people that are always looking for something new or unusual. So for the longest time period, it was, of course, South America. Then there was a lot of emphasis on Asia over the last few years. But then, especially because there are some really extraordinary photographers here in the US that have taken pictures of darters and shiners in their most beautiful colors, that people were like, wow, there's really cool fish in North America. And many of those you can actually keep quite easily in a fish tank. So that's what drove the interest in Europe. And I think what is also part of it, most of these fish are extremely difficult to come by in Europe. There's multiple reasons for it. One is many have never been exported to Europe. That's rule number one, meaning there's also no breeders. Now you can find lots of breeders that breed rainbow shiners. I mean, that's like 1 million fish over in Europe now. But other species are very rare. And then there's essentially no commercial export from the US to anywhere. I mean, it just doesn't exist, which I always say it's probably a thing that a lot of people here are actually not really aware, oddly enough, what swims around in some of the states in the US. I mean, it's just extraordinary, the diversity of fish and their adaptations, etc. But of course, it's also the regulations. I mean, in some states, keeping native fishes is almost impossible without any special permits. And I wish there would be some more effort actually to maybe make these fish more widely available in terms of breeding them commercially and actually making them a trade commodity, because in the end, for some of those more rare fish, that might be actually the best way of protecting them.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because we actually have, not me personally, but some of my colleagues are working on reproductive methods for commercialization of some of the natives out of our lab here. So they're looking at some of the sunfishes and some of the, not so much darters because we're not that cold, but sunfishes right. And some of the other shiners. But so, yeah, that's really, really interesting to hear about.
I think there would be, especially in Europe and also in Asia. I mean, if you're talking shipping some of those red shiners to Asia, I mean, you get crazy money for it. Now, you can say, well, that's all about greed. But the truth is, if somebody can make a good living breeding something like that, why not?
Sure.
I mean, that's these are jobs. And most people who breed fish, they're not in it to get, become millionaires, because most don't. But somebody say out in the rural area where jobs are maybe more difficult to come by, if they can produce something that has a market value without destroying the whole environment, that's the way forward.
Sure. So in this issue, you also have an article on dwarf crayfish, which I didn't even realize, I guess there was interest in. I mean, I knew some of the other crayfish, but I didn't really know anything about the dwarf crayfish. Is that something you see a lot of interest in, I guess, either here and or up in Europe?
Yes, especially a lot of the more colorful crayfish species out of New Guinea and Australia are extremely popular in Europe, but also in other places of Asia. Obviously, there's actually quite a big problem with crayfish because they can become quite invasive. I mean, here in the US, we have the rusty crayfish. We wiped out most of the native fauna on crayfish by bringing in North American crayfish.
Right. Because
they carry a fungus that is deadly to European species, but the US species are resilient or resistant. And again, that comes to, on one hand, the trade makes critters that are quite hidden and unknown to the population at large more popular and people become more aware of it, but it also carries risks. And unfortunately, the trade overall, but also organizations, clubs, etc., we need to do a much, much better job about telling everybody anything you keep in a fish tank can never, under no circumstances, be released into the wild. It doesn't matter where you live. You can be living on the North Pole. It does not belong out into the wild. Now, granted, that requires solutions, and one of the Amazonas magazines a few issues back actually showed the Sea Grant program's effort about taking fish back, and that might be something for a different show to go into. But yeah, the take back program, kind of like what Fish and Wildlife does with snakes in Florida, the amnesty program.
Yeah, and we actually did that for a number of years with the Florida Fish and Wildlife with fish as well. We had take back program for any non-natives that people didn't want anymore. So yeah, no, definitely, you're definitely spot on with that. That's a huge issue. Have Attitude is a program through, I think, PJAC, looking at trying to make sure people are aware of not releasing fish into the natural environment. It's very, very important that you mention that. And yes,
and it's actually quite successful and can be a huge PR tool for the organized hobby. We did it here in Minnesota, and when we did it the first time, we combined it with our regular auction, and the result was all the fish we got back, they generated some funds, $400 or $500 total when we auctioned them off. So they found a new home immediately, which was great. Yep. And we actually were able to give the cash back to the Sea Grant program. So it helped fund research. And for the club, it was superb. The first time we did it, there was 2 TV stations or 2 or 3 radio stations showing up at our auction. I mean, in terms of PR, it was just fantastic.
Yeah, that's excellent. Definitely. No, good points. So as we're kind of winding down on this interview, and I know there's a million more things we can talk about, do you have any hints at what might be coming into some future issues of Amazonas?
Well, we're talking about all kinds of different things. One of the next issues will be on nano aquariums, which is an extremely popular topic, especially with people who love shrimp or dwarf fish. So there will be an issue coming up on that. We also have an issue that this will be actually the next issue volume 8.5. I don't say much more than we call it the Halloween issue. And it will be I predict it will be quite controversial, but I will explain in at least my part of the editorial why we decided to write about this topic.
Okay.
I think it's important to cover all avenues or all fields of fish keeping, because if you ignore certain fields, you leave a vacuum, and the vacuum is usually taken up by extremists or the left or the right. And I do not want to see it ground to crazy ideas. So I think it will, and I hope it will start a discussion. That is essentially the goal that we have.
Well, now I'm really interested to see what that's about now. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think as a publisher producing paper, we have to think ahead and stay relevant. I do think the print literature goes through sort of a renaissance lately. I mean, book sales are up, and actually e-readers are down, which is kind of interesting. And I think as long as you put out a good product, and that has nothing to do with me. The good product, Amazonas magazine, is a combination of fantastic authors and photographers, and a fantastic team in Vermont, in Colorado, and here in Minnesota that actually puts it together. So my gratitude mostly goes to my co-publishers and my production team and my editor-in-chief, or executive editor, Ann Whitman, who is majorly responsible for how this shapes up. And of course, we have a great editorial board that contributes ideas and is always there with advice. I mean, without all that teamwork, this would not happen. So I have little or nothing to do with the success of it. I'm just the background.
I'm sure you do. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I again want to thank our guest, Stefan Tanner, and our producer, Mark Winter, for making the show possible. Stefan, did you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
Well, just keep fish and have fun with it, because it's a hobby. It's supposed to be fun first and foremost.
Great advice. And yeah, hopefully we can get a lot of the younger folks involved as well. It's definitely a great way to kind of enter the arena of biology and environment and ecology and pet keeping. So thanks again for joining us, Stefan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It has been a pleasure.
Please be sure to check out Amazonas Magazine if you haven't already, as well as Swiss Tropicals. As I mentioned, Amazonas is incredibly beautiful, great detail, great articles, really takes the hobby to the next level. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for a show, feel free to email me at drroy@petliferadio.com. That's DRROY@petliferadio.com. Until next time, please visit your local aquarium stores, keep your tanks clean and your fish healthy. And again, definitely check out Amazonas and Swiss Tropicals.
Let's Talk Pets, every week on demand, only on PetLifeRadio.com.